Mr. Gustafson, please call forth your first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I am about to call forth my first witness. The testimony that you will receive will give you absolutely no doubt as to the qualities, both positive and negative, of my client, from which you will surely be able to determine whether or not my client is a possible person of interest to you. I now call forth my first witness, a character witness, as you would. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to be here before you once more to deliver another character witness to your consideration. This one is a special one for me because this one will be the character of the very first role-playing game that I had, truly, that was my own. I had encountered Dungeons & Dragons through one of the box sets years prior, and this belonged to my parents. And I didn't understand it then. I had nobody to work with it, so it was eventually lost. When I rediscovered role-playing games later on, this was the first role-playing book that I had purchased for myself. I had spent some time talking with role-playing games with another friend, and this excited me to get this book. This became my entry point into the greater world of fantasy role-playing games, and it still has a very secure spot in my heart. This book represents, in its time period, a bridging of the gap from the early days of role-playing, when the typical role player filled a particularly tiny little niche. Somebody who probably drifted in from wargaming, and somebody who was intelligent enough to understand the abstract concepts without a lot of help. There were some examples and things included in the various rules, but also a lot of complicated jargon, a higher language barrier for some people, and it required a great deal of imagination and sometimes help from other people who had experience with the game. This book was designed to be played by people who had no real experience. It was written in very accessible language. I am using what is commonly called the BECMI. It's an anagram for Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, Immortal. The full set of rules that would take you from 1st to 36th level and beyond with the Immortals rules, if you manage to play for that long. This is the basic set, the red box, and this would take you up to only 3rd level. But by that slow progression, this gave you everything that you needed so that you could start playing without being overwhelmed by complicated rules. Everything was metered out so that your experience was only going to be as overwhelming as it needed to be. In this case, you encountered the difficulties of getting your first equipment, learning your very first abilities, and only having very few choices for making your character. And things that eventually became more complicated, like overland travel. That was broken out into the expert set. Things like warfare and large-scale conflicts. That was broken out in the companion set. The very upper end of the adventurer's experience and dealing with artifacts and things like that. That was in the master set. So this was, by its very nature, designed to be very simple and engaging for anybody to play. You didn't start out making a character. You were handed a sample character to read through the experiences of a first session. And then, using that same character, you were allowed to go on a solo adventure with everything that you needed provided by the book, with the exception of just a few dice, which came with the box set. The original box set itself, I don't have the box, but it had the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Handbook, which had all of the details on how to create your own dungeons, sampling of monsters, magic treasures, but not a great deal. Nothing overly arcane or complicated. It was all designed to be relatively, easy to handle and process, with lots and lots and lots of extra text explaining how to set things up, how to approach the complexities of engaging in a group. The player's handbook approached that from the player's side. It explained how to be a part in an adventuring party, the kind of things that really weren't outlined in the original Dungeons and Dragons and even advanced Dungeons and Dragons, because, again, place in war games, these things were meant for people who had a bit more experience with using disparate units and taking advantage of advantages and skills and powers that leverage you the advantages. And this is from somebody who, for somebody who didn't have those experiences, which was perfectly appropriate for me. While I had played board games and the like, this is a totally different world. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a character following the rules for this book, which you have to go all the way through to page 46 to get to the actual rules for creating your own character. And we will discuss the path that you take and the different options that are available. I think you'll find it very interesting if you've never experienced something like this, and if you've only experienced later versions of Dungeons and Dragons, realizing just how you could pare it down and still have an engaging role-playing game to play with under the banner of Dungeons & Dragons, with very familiar monsters and creatures and things of that nature. So, let's begin, shall we? Alright, here we are with basic Dungeons & Dragons. This is commonly simply just called Dungeons & Dragons rather than BECMI or anything like this, because you had original Dungeons & Dragons, which was probably the best one to call Dungeons & Dragons, but still. Then you had Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which came out at about the same time here. And then later on you had 2nd edition, 3rd edition, and the editions were always very important. An interesting departure in this book that you would notice from any of the other versions of Dungeons & Dragons, the art is absolutely incredible in this. This is where you have the big name artists that start to get involved in role-playing games, and it really changes the game. After talking to the editor, Frank Menser, he explained that a lot of the design decisions for the book were engaged to attempt to bring the accessibility of Dungeons and Dragons to more people, and that meant breaking into places like bookstores that wanted that kind of art to grab people's attention, and this art is incredibly engaging. This was illustrated by a combination of Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley, who are both amazing fine artists. So it's very pleasing to the eye, and all the interior illustrations I find to be very, very engaging. One of my personal favorites, and I just talked to Mr. Easley at a convention, I really would love a print of this. This shows an adventurer not in the dungeon, but in a shop, just buying gear to resupply himself. I absolutely love this piece, but he says that there's no prints for it available, which makes me a little sad. Alright, to find out how to make a character, you actually have to go past all the rules for character classes and go towards near the end of the book to page 48. I was slightly mistaken. The way you make a character is actually fairly similar to the way that you made characters for original Dungeons & Dragons, OD&D. And that is, you take 3 6-sided dice, and you roll. And you go in line to figure out what kind of character. Again, you don't come in with preconceived notions about the character that you want to make. You make the character that you roll. Also, we're using the same simple character sheet. It is designed to be able to churn out characters very quickly. In case one dies, you can just simply roll up another. So, we're going to roll up this character. Again, I don't really know what I'm going to end up with, which is kind of exciting. But this, again, was one of the first things that people house ruled. A lot of groups, my own included, allowed you to roll dice in advance and then put the stats where you wanted to put them. So if you wanted to make a fighter and you had one high stat, you would put it in your strength. And your characters were very, very kind of iconically driven. In later versions of D&D, if you had say you wanted to make a fighter, but you wanted to make an archer, strength might not have been your most significant concern. You would have wanted dexterity for a better chance to hit with missile weapons. In this game, no. Strength is going to be your prime requisite if you are a fighter, and that gives you substantial bonuses to acquiring experience, so it is hard to turn that down. But let's see what we get here, shall we? Well, we have a 10 to start out with in strength. Not inspiring, but not terrible. And we have a 9 in intelligence. Probably not going to be a wizard. In terms of wisdom, we get a 9. I'm seeing a rather depressing trend going on here. And we get a 12 in dexterity. And an 11 in constitution. And now everybody's favorite dump stat, the charisma. And 13. Yeah, figures my highest stat would be charisma. Alright, so this is not a useless character. All my stats are 9 or higher. If I didn't roll anything higher than a 9, the book actually recommends re-rolling. But in this case, we don't need to do that. So we have... what do we have here? We have a character who's not very intelligent, so a magic user is kind of out. Magic users are the wizards of the game. I do enjoy playing magic users, but they are hard to keep alive in this game, so he's out. 9 wisdom, again, a cleric isn't going to be a very good choice for us. Clerics are a little challenging. They don't get healing spells right away, but they can wear any armor and gear, and they're, make decent fighters in a pinch. My dexterity is one of my highest stats, so my character is definitely looking at being more roguelike. Constitution is, again, pretty average, so nothing is really going to be giving me any kind of breaks here. And a 10 strength, likewise, is not going to give me any huge breaks as far as combat goes. The 13 charisma, the only real advantage, will give me a slight bonus for social engagement, which is nice if I'm the face of the group. But if somebody else rolls a higher charisma, my character is going to be relegated to being, relatively tame. Because I didn't roll anything exceptional, however, that does give me a little bit of freedom in this game. If I rolled something really well, say like I rolled a very high intelligence, I would really be pushed into playing a magic user to take advantage of that. Because I didn't, but because I didn't roll terribly, I can actually go and take some other character class that normally I wouldn't consider as much, including one of the racial character classes, which I think I'm going to do here. I think I am going to make myself up a halfling. To make a halfling, I have to have a constitution and dexterity of at least a 9. Halflings function as fighters, so they're warrior types, but they have a few special abilities, which might just keep my character alive long enough to level a few times. So as far as class goes, we're going to make him a halfling. Level 1, which I will not put in ink. I always do that in pencil. Player's name, that's me. Dungeon Master for whoever gets to be my Dungeon Master. And I can now write these stats and quite a bit bigger. So, there is another option that we have, though. The opportunity to exchange ability score points. You can raise a prime requisite by lowering other ability scores. It's like practicing hard to learn your class at the cost of not developing another ability. How you do that is you take your prime requisite, and only your prime requisite, and you increase it by 1 for every 2 points that you drop another statistic. Constitution and Charisma cannot be exchanged with others, so yes, I'm going to have that 13 Charisma. Your Dexterity cannot be lowered, and no score can go below 9. Well, that doesn't leave us with any opportunities. So we're not going to be reducing any stats. We're going to have exactly the stats that you see here. So that's fun. None of these statistics give any kind of adjustment. And by the way, I'm writing in pen because in Basic Dungeons and Dragons, your stats really don't change. It's possible, but if anything that earth-shattering happened, I would probably just get a new character and rewrite it. There is no adjustment for 10 Strength, 9 Intelligence, 9 Wisdom, 12 Dexterity, 11 Constitution. Charisma of 13 would give a +1. Bonuses go in bands between 9 and 12. That is considered average, so there's no bonus or penalty to that. Below 9 would start giving you penalties. And it goes, the first 3 numbers above or below give a plus or minus 1. Then the 2 numbers beyond that give a plus or minus 2. And then the worst you can get or the best you can get, the 3 or the 18 give you a plus or minus 3. So in this case, we only have the Charisma giving us any kind of modifier. So after we have that, we've rolled for ability scores, we've chosen the class, our prime requisites, and all the other fun stuff. We go back just a page to the Halfling. A Halfling has 2 prime requisites, Strength and Dexterity. If either of these is 13 or greater, they gain a 5% experience bonus. If both are 13 or greater, the experience bonus is 10%, which is actually a fairly easy thing to do. It's not very difficult at all, but I didn't do that. So that is unfortunate. So we're just getting standard experience, which is fine, honestly. A Halfling Warrior only needs 2,000 experience points to go up to the next level. So a character, if he can survive for any length of time, would actually be able to do quite well. Hit dice. Oh, yes. Another house rule that I have had for quite some time is you get maximum hit points at first level. It helps your survivability if you can at least take a dagger shot to begin with. A luxury that thieves in this game and magic users with their 4-sided hit die don't really get much of. In this case, I have no bonus to my Constitution. I have a 6-sided die, and I roll, and I get a 3. Also, written in pencil. Level 1. All right. With that information. So we have the prime requisite. I always underline the prime requisites just for my own point of reference, but in this case it's so that I know I don't get any bonus. I have a kind of a, this is not the basic character record sheet. It's close. The front page is just about identical, but it gives a few extra bits of information that help out with alternate classes. In this case, it's enough to write down that I have 0 bonus or penalty, and I need 2,000 experience to go up a level. All right, so that's finished. We can then move on. A halfling may wear any kind of armor and may use a shield, but their armor and shields have to be specially made for their small size. Even dwarf-size armor is too big, so any armor that we get, we're going to assume that we have it special made for us or made by halflings who would make them for our size. A halfling may use any small-sized weapon, daggers, short swords, or short bows. They may not use two-handed swords, long bows, battle axes, pole arms, or other large weapons, which fits their small size and realistically doesn't really impact my character drastically. This is not a character who would be likely to go wading in with a greatsword. I want to get as much armor between me and any opponents as I can. Shield would definitely be a useful thing. So smaller weapon was going to be in the cards anyhow. Because I don't have any bonus to strength or dexterity, it really doesn't matter what I use terribly. I'm going to be shooting for doing that 1d6 damage with my weapon whenever I can. Halfling gets several combat bonuses, some due to their small size, and can hide easily in the woodlands. So, special abilities. In combat, we have halflings often use missile weapons and are better at dodging attacks from larger creatures. I have a -2 armor class when attacked by large creatures. And Basic Edition used the descending armor class scale, so the lower your armor class is, the better. And yes, armor classes can go into the negatives. Some people today might see that as a little bass-ackwards, but quite honestly, that's how we got used to playing. So to me, it feels like home. -2 AC versus large opponents. Also, -1 or +1 bonus to the hit roll when using missile weapons. So that means I'm going to want to be able to fire as much as possible. I don't have any other bonuses, so that little +1 bonus is significant for this character. +1 to missile attacks. And also a +1 bonus to individual initiative. The default for rolling for initiative is both sides roll for the entire side to find out which side is going to go first. You can also go with individual initiative, which is handy if you've got halflings or characters that can exploit having high dexterity. I believe that also added to your individual initiative. So, yeah, in this case, we'd be able to move a little bit quicker, and we'd have decent missile attacks. Also, hiding. Outdoors, halflings can hide and can only be detected 10% of the time. So, in that case, a special skill, 90%, which, if they only have a 10% chance of seeing you, you have a 90% chance of succeeding. Of hiding in the great outdoors. Now, the basic set basically assumes that you're going into dungeons, so I'm not going to have as much of an opportunity to take full advantage of that, but they can even hide in dungeons, not with as much success. If they can find shadows or cover to hide, attempt at hiding will succeed 1/3 of the time, so 33% chance of hiding in dungeons. / shadows. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, 33% is good, but it's hardly reliable. And I would counter with the fact that the trained professionals, the thieves, at first level have a 10% chance of hiding in shadows. Plus they have an entirely different skill call in moving silently. They can move while they're concealed. My halfling cannot. He has to basically freeze in order to get that bonus, but I have a significantly better chance of hiding than a trained thief does. And yes, for those of you playing modern games, thieves eventually become rogues. They resent being told that they are dirty thieves when they have so many other opportunities. Many of them are just professional treasure finders. Halfling saving throws. The demi-humans generally had decent saving throws. The halflings had the best saving throws in the game. Versus death rays and poison, their saving throw is an 8. Again, writing in pencil, because as you level up, they do decline. Magic wands is a 9. Turn to stone or paralysis is a 10. Dragon breath is a 13. And rod, staves, or spells is a 12. So, Good saving throws to start with, certainly. Of course, you want to, to survive in games like these, you want to avoid having to make saving throws as often as possible, especially saving throws that lead to death. Poison is a big one for that. Because we don't have a bonus to Constitution, not going to get any help versus that. But having an 8 is pretty solid. That is a 60% chance of surviving versus those kind of attacks, which is nice. Again, considering that other classes have considerably higher. I think, unless I miss my guess, yeah, they're as good as dwarves at that. As a matter of fact, their saving throw line reads the same as dwarves, who also have the best. Elves do not have nearly as good a selection of saving throws, and the human classes are likewise much worse. So, that is all of the nuts and bolts of the statistics. Oh yeah, another thing. Because this game loved the matrices, they have a hit table, of course. So I should write down my chances to hit. It was kind of interesting. I was at a convention playing a game that was run by Stefan Picorni, the head of Dwarven Forge. It was a lot of fun. But I had a bunch of players. They were confronted with a to-hit line table, and they didn't know how to handle it, which was kind of funny. Because everything now has been relegated to simple math. So you instead add bonuses to see if you hit something. And in this case, character hit roll table. Yes. For basic edition, all characters will have the same hit table throughout until they get to 3rd level. So 9 hits on a 10, 8, armor class 8 hits on 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So, obviously, whenever I get a chance to, I want to use missile attacks to give myself a little bit of a boost there. But, all in all, as long as we can get some armor, this character is fairly survivable. The next step, and which will be the final step for this character because we don't have to select spells, we do want to look at the other bonuses that we get. And we rolled for the hit points. Bonuses, penalties, we already filled out. Roll for money. That is 3 6-sided dice, the result of which multiplied by 10. This is something we need high because we're playing a fighter-type character. And we're rewarded with an 11, which turns into 110 gold. 110. Not terrible. Then you buy equipment, and then figure out your other information based on that. So your equipment tables in the middle of the book. Again, these are going to be very, very basic. These summary charts in the middle of the book are actually genius. It allows making a new character to go very, very quickly. So, our choices are, first of all, we need to survive. So my first concern is getting armor between me and any enemies. Plate armor is 60 gold. And in this game, there's no penalty to having plate armor. You can walk around in plate armor, do cartwheels, hide, no problem. If I have a dungeon master who just, goes off of the base rules, this is fine. Also, the thing about armor is that it is fairly heavy. And something that I would definitely have to keep an eye on as I run. My character is not exceptionally strong, but the thought of being able to put metal plates in between me and incoming blows if I'm expected to be a frontline fighter is, well, it's pretty important. So I think in this case I would go with plate armor for 60. Equipment carried, armor. Plate armor and a shield. That's going to be a total of 70 gold. That might be overplaying my hand a little bit. I think much as the sample character, I think we're going to start in chain armor and a shield, and we'll work up from there. We're just going to try very hard not to get hit. We're going to shoot for a second line fighter, somebody who can jump up and fight in a pinch, but we'll try to stay back and shoot as much as possible. So chainmail armor. So chainmail and a shield. Alright. For that, it's going to cost us a total of 50 of our starting gold. So we're down to 60. Which will still give us some money for weaponry. We need two different kinds. We need to be able to shoot from a distance, and we need to be able to fight to defend ourselves in close range as needed. Now they're fairly vague on what we can use weapon-wise, but hand axes certainly should be within range. A light crossbow could be within range. A short bow should be within range. Daggers, of course. Short swords. I think a normal sword should be able to be wielded two-handed, but we're not going to do that. And as far as maces and clubs, yeah, those would probably fall within range. Polearms, no, those are two-handed. A sling is a light missile weapon, and you can find ammunition for it everywhere. They're stones, really. So go to a riverside and find enough pebbles, you have weaponry. Spear might be considered to be too long, depending on your game master. Certainly, halflings would be pretty good with spears, but in this case, we're going to go with a short bow, which costs 25, and a quiver with 20 arrows. And we'll go with a quiver with 20 arrows. Gear, always written in pencil because it can be lost relatively easily. That takes away half of our gold. We're down to 30. We're then going to look at something that we can use in hand-to-hand, a short sword. That brings us down to 23. Also not a bad idea to carry a dagger, both as a thrown weapon and a last resort weapon. And that costs 3. So now we're down to 20 gold. That is a fairly decent selection starting out for weaponry. We're not going to have a lot of money. So we have armor, we have weapons. Now if we had gone up to the plate armor, I would be out of money right now. So it was actually a good idea not to do that. Generally, only if you roll really, really well for your starting cash should you really think about doing that. So that gives us 20 gold to spend on basic equipment. Everybody should have a backpack. $15 gold. Flask of oil. We're going to stay away from oil and torches right now. Or oil and lanterns. Lantern is 10 and flasks of oil are 2, so yeah. We're just going to say no to that for the time being. Mirror, something down the road, possibly. A 10-foot long wooden pole. Can be cumbersome for a halfling, but yeah, it's just too big. No reason. And I want to try to be able to get into small places whenever I can. Rations, food. Rations are kind of a dicey thing to get right away, unless you have the cash. I could, just have a week's worth of iron rations, which can survive in dungeons. But if I want to spend time in dungeons, standard rations tend to spoil in dungeons very quickly. It's unpreserved. And as the rules say, if you spend an overnight, your standard rations can be ruined. Also, if you're going to go splashing in water, things like that, you don't want your turkey to go off when you are out and about. 50 feet of rope, however, that is standard adventuring gear that we should have. And that is 1 gold, so we're down to 14. Sacks. Well, you want to be able to carry the treasure out, so 2 large sacks. Not a bad idea to have. So those are 2 each. So we are down to 10. We are going to reserve 5 gold so that we have enough food. So that leaves us with 5 left. Let's do some quick math. That's 40, 50, 80. That's left 30, 25. We should do this proper. Start with 110. And knock 40 off. That brings us to 70. 10 off, 60. 30 for the bow and arrows, 30. Longsword and dagger, 20. Backpack, 15. 50 feet of rope and 2 large sacks, down to 10. I've got 5 gold left to spend on my gear. Halflings can't see in the dark, so we should have some way of seeing in the dark. And 6 torches and a tinderbox. A tinderbox is basically the medieval equivalent of a book of matches. And 6 torches, that'll cost us a total of 4. So a tinderbox and 6 torches. Now we are fairly self-sufficient. We can see, we can fight, we can move around with the rope, we can carry stuff out. I've got 1 gold left beyond the budget I'm allotting myself. And I'm going to get a water skin, because sometimes being able to carry liquids is a good thing. If I was very in the weeds as far as money, I probably could avoid getting the tinderbox if I'm going to travel in a group, because every group has at least a couple of tinderboxes. But for the most part, this is essential gear. Had I rolled really poorly, I would have had to skimp down to leather armor, which would have saved me 20 gold. And I might have had to eschew the shield. And possibly even have thought about the short bow as something expendable, since it was considerably more expensive, and it's going to cost me in restocking with arrows periodically. But right now, this halfling is pretty well self-reliant. He can do all right. And like I said, if I was going to really think that I was going to need that food, I could go and grab some food before I head out to the dungeon, but I have 5 gold left for reserves depending on the situation that my character finds himself in. And that is... Oh, and I must name him, considering that he is a halfling. Halflings oftentimes have woodland and pastoral names. He can be Benny Hardleaf. I could have written that in pen, but that's all right. Oh, an alignment. We should figure out an alignment. You have 3 choices in basic Dungeons & Dragons. You have lawful, which means you're a good guy. Neutral, you can take it or leave it. Or chaotic, which is bad. people who have experience with alignment know that that isn't a perfect breakdown, but it'll suffice for this. We'll be lawful, so let other people know they can trust us. Also, we need to find out what our armor class is. And prime requisite intelligence charisma bonuses +1. Interesting to note, I can have a maximum of 5 retainers, and they will have a morale of 8, which is pretty good. So yeah, I would be in charge of running the henchmen if nobody else has a higher armor class or a higher charisma, which is certainly possible. My fire range at short range, my short bow has a distance of 50 feet. I get a +1, 100, 150. So, if possible, if I'm going to be in an encounter, I want to be at short range, inside of 50 feet, but not in hand-to-hand, shooting my bow. That'll give me a net of +2 to hit, which is good. Even at decent ranges, I can still hit fairly well, but yes. Adjusting for dexterity, range, cover, and magic. So that will possibly give me my best chances to be effective in a fight. Doing my 1d6 damage for short bows. Variable weapons. The arrows do 1d6. Short sword does 1d6. Dagger does 1d4. Not modified because my stats don't modify anything right now. Alright, I don't have any magical gear. All of my other stuff is pretty well salted away. The only other thing that I would do would be to calculate encumbrance. Based on what I've got, my armor and everything. Which I believe gets hand-waved in basic and becomes more of an issue in expert. In this case, encumbrance is primarily the treasure that you can pull out. If a character is wearing armor or merely leather and carrying the basic encumbrance... Okay. If a character is wearing no armor or merely leather and carrying the normal equipment taken on an adventure, they can carry 300 coins worth of weight, which is roughly 30 pounds. That type of character can pick up 100 coins and still use the top line of the chart, which is base speed of 120 and counter speed of 40. If a character is wearing metal armor, whether chain or plate, and carrying other normal equipment, then the basic encumbrance is 700 coins. So 70 pounds of gear I'm carrying. I think. Let's see. Or is coins 20? The weights kind of change a little bit here and there. Okay, so my gear and stuff comes out to a total encumbrance right now of 700 coins. I have to remember which game I'm playing here. So right now my armor and equipment load is 700, which encompasses my weapons and gear, which is kind of a nice way to sum everything up. If I was just carrying the basics, if I didn't have armor or just leather armor, I'd be down at 300 coins weight. And since I'm at 700, my basic speed, if I don't pick anything else up, my normal speed is 90. And in an encounter, I can move 30 feet per round. And that's not on the front page, it's on the back page, I suspect. No, it's not. So this is something that would be referenced, I guess, if you got into an encounter and you were checking relative speeds. But I'm going to put down 90 feet and in parentheses 30 feet. So that is the distance I move in a single turn. That is moving through a dungeon carefully. And we're going to do a video on exactly how realistic those speeds get sometime in the future. And then we have 30 feet in a round, meaning when a fight is going on and I'm not being as careful, I want to dash around, I can move up to 30 feet. Halflings are not slammed with a movement penalty in this version of the game, so that's good. If I was going to start carrying lots of treasure, I'm going to be slowed down considerably. But as of right now, I can still have a decent range of stuff before I get slowed down to a crawl. Thousands of coins in weight. Which is perfectly fine with me. We have name for the weight. It's in coins. 1 coin of treasure weighs about 1/10 of a pound. So yes, my gear weighs about 70 pounds. And I can carry up to 2,400 pounds and still move. That's 240 pounds of gear and treasure that I can cart out. Any more than that, I can't move. And if I carry just 100 coins in treasure, I will be slowed down to 60 feet per turn with an encounter speed of 20 per round, which is fairly slow, but quite honestly, it's what's expected of the walking tanks that fighters tend to be. My character is going to want to be selective in the treasure he gets so that he doesn't suffer that weight penalty too easily. And if he gets to that point, he should really think about leaving the dungeon before he gets compromised too badly for his speed. Or keep it all in sacks that he can easily drop if he needs to scoot. So yeah, that would be the calculation for encumbrance, which is a lot simpler than any other version. It gets more complicated when you get to the more advanced books, of course. I believe in Expert, it gives you encounter weights, encumbrance weights for armor and weapons, so that you can decide that, encumbrance weights for all of the gear, basically, so that you can you know exactly how much you're being slowed down. But we have a character. This poor Benny here is not an overwhelmingly powerful character. He will be someone very reliant on having other people in the group because he doesn't do a great deal of damage. He can't take a great deal of damage, hardly anything at all. Oh yeah, one other thing, armor class. Oh, I am getting into amateur hour here. I humbly apologize. Armor class for chainmail is 5, and a bonus of +1 for the shield gives him an armor class of 4, which is decent but not fantastic. So, but he can do a little fighting. He can do a decent amount of shooting. It's not going to hit very hard, but he can do it. And he can hide if he needs to. He has a chance at surviving to get to 2nd level. And with a good roll for hit points there, he might be able to really make something of himself. I certainly would not feel overly crushed or defeated playing this character out. He is not going to grab headlines with ridiculous stats, but all in all, this would be a fairly decent first level character for basic Dungeons and Dragons. So, what did we learn? Well, let's go back to me. So we have Benny, a young, inexperienced halfling looking to make his place in the world. Not the most auspicious start. A higher die roll would have been nice in the character generation, and one of the 4 most likely prime attributes might have led us to a more, let's just say, an easier choice. I chose the halfling because of the bonuses to evasion, figuring that he would rather hide than try to tough a fight out. If I was feeling more aggressive with the character, I might have chosen a dwarf. They have abilities for detection, they have infravision, they do have some nice advantages. But Benny could work fairly well. But, of course, you have to look at all of the different other character abilities and classes that we did not consider. The fighter have in basic D&D no real strengths outside of they use a D8 for hit die, which is the best that you can do in the game as of right now. They have the ability to use any weapons and armor, which is essential if you're going to be out in front of the party defending them from a fight. And really it's going to be reliant on how well you can hold that line. Good armor is essential. If I was going to be a frontline fighter, you get the good armor right off the bat, and then you start looking for your weapon. But it all depends on how you end up rolling. If you get a good dexterity too, that's nice as a fighter. Good constitution, extra hit points. I consider fighters the best character to choose if you get multiple high statistics. Strength, dexterity, constitution. You've got all the makings for a dynamic fighter. Just strength, a fighter would be okay, but I also might want to think about being a dwarf. Some of those extra abilities can be awfully handy, especially if you don't have to juggle a torch because you have infravision. You can have a shield and weapon just as easily. Fighters, of course, down the line get superseded if you have wizards with their fireballs and such, but the fact that their combat statistics get better quickly means that you can engage monsters at the level your group is at and have a reasonable chance of striking them, especially if you have that nice strength bonus. The magic user is very hard to keep alive at low levels unless you've got a good group. Their basic spells are your iconic spells to choose from, and you only get one spell. And once you've cast it, you're done until you can rest and get your spell back. The sampling of spells that you would have to choose from, things like Charm Person, Magic Missile, Sleep. In my mind, Sleep is the ultimate spell that you get at first level. There's few monsters in the basic set that are immune to it, and it's capable of shutting down an entire encounter like that. If you are attacked by an overwhelming force, one of the biggest dangers of low-level adventurers is being attacked by just too many opponents to fight off. Sleep can get you out of a lot of hardship. Although some people do prefer other spells like Protection from Evil for the other protections that it can give you. Many of the spells do a good job of maintaining utility throughout your character's career. Floating Disc is a great one for carrying out treasure and sometimes fallen comrades. Of course, they don't have the wizards' names that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and later spells do. They're all very generically named so that they can be changed and tweaked by the game master for your game, or dungeon master. Clerics. Clerics basically have to be treated like fighters at first level because they don't get spell casting, but they only roll a d6 for hit points. So, even more important that they get good armor to protect themselves. And ultimately, you really want to keep your cleric alive as long as it can so that they can get those essential healing spells and buffing spells that make your jobs a lot easier. One thing we encountered when we were doing dungeon crawling was there was a general push to try to get a cleric to live long enough to be able to cast those essential curing spells and keep the fighters upright. Their turning ability is also excellent against undead. Even at lowest levels, it gives you at least a chance of avoiding an encounter or perhaps knocking off some of the opponents in an encounter to make it easier to fight the undead. Otherwise, the undead are a slog. Many of them have nasty special abilities, but otherwise they often attack in large numbers. With a cleric, that makes those kind of encounters manageable. Thieves at low level are tricky. They often make great missile fighters because they typically have a higher dexterity. So since they have the same attack line as a fighter at first through third level through basic, they're just as good as a fighter, and if they have a high dexterity, they can be even more effective than some fighters. However, their statistics as far as their skills are terrible. Having low chances of success for some of their most essential jobs. Finding traps, removing traps, stealth. Those numbers are very low at first level. surviving by using your skills is difficult. A thief who succeeds and advances to high levels is an asset, but a thief who can't use their brains to get around traps at low levels is probably going to be a casualty. I can't express enough how difficult it is to get a functioning thief. They almost are. They're as fragile as magic users, and even though they can wear leather armor, which is not very effective, they have to stay at a distance from enemies and use their skills. And players should be hopefully one of your smartest ones, capable of sizing up situations and acting with appropriate caution at least. Daredevil thieves generally don't live very long. Otherwise, they get a good range of weapons that they have access to. Aside from their thieves' tools, they don't have any real commitment for gear, so since their armor is relatively cheap, they can, especially with a good money roll, they can bring in some much-needed gear the rest of the party might lack. Thieves definitely have their uses. That is for sure. You just have to survive those early levels when your chances for doing things is pretty low. Dwarves are basically fighters. They also roll the d8 for their hit dice, which is nice. That is going to be necessary, of course, to have somebody who can take at least a shot before falling back and retreating, or for healing. Being able to wear any armor, being able to have any weapon. Their ability to detect stonework, shifting walls, pit traps can be a lifesaver at early levels, especially since your thieves' chances of finding the same are not going to be very good. So having a dwarf around can be very nice for those kind of situations, as long as the dwarf thinks to look for them. Again, your player has to really take advantage of those detection abilities or they'll never come up. But otherwise, a dwarf is a stout fighter, and they are a little bit more taxing to level up. They require more experience than a standard fighter, and eventually they do hit a cap before the fighters do with how many hit points they get. But they are a solid class for keeping your party going and being a frontline character. The elf, a difficult blend, fighter and magic user. They have several strong advantages. I do enjoy elves. They can wear any armor, so you can have an elf in plate mail armor and a shield, and they can cast spells. Just like a wizard, a magic user. But their saving throws are terrible. They require twice as much experience to go up a level as a fighter does. So technically you get a little bit of a break, and if you had to get as much experience between one and the other, but yeah, it's tough to survive as an elf for a while. You need to get good armor, you need to get good weapons, and you have at least the luxury, since you have other things to fall back on, the luxury of being able to pick spells that your wizard your magic user, if you have one in the group, will probably pick spells based on surviving and contributing. As an elf, you can choose spells that buff and enhance the party or weaken your enemies without being directly damaging, and you can be very effective, which is a nice advantage. Their ability to detect secret doors can be absolutely a godsend and stop you from wasting time in a dungeon. Immunity to ghoul paralysis is very specific, but it makes ghouls less dangerous, so that's not a bad thing. Ghouls are absolutely party killers at low levels. They're just really difficult to survive because it takes them forever to go up levels. Elves need high statistics, more so than almost any other class. Not necessarily the high intelligence, even though it is their prime requisite. The high strength if they're going to contribute in a fight, but they need some constitution. And this is before stats could get penalized based on your race. So a good constitution and a good dexterity are really essential for an elf. High strength and intelligence are a bonus. If you get, if you even get a +1 bonus to your strength and intelligence, yeah, I'd sincerely consider an elf, especially if I had some dexterity to survive with, and maybe some constitution to give me a few extra hit points. If I rolled really well across all attributes, yeah, I would definitely pick an elf for basic D&D. And we made a halfling. I described all the advantages and disadvantages of that. Now, to people who played other versions of Dungeons and Dragons, some of the things in this might seem very appealing. Encumbrance. Well, if you're wearing armor and you have your gear, it's that. Everything else is just whatever you pick up in the dungeon. That's easy to track. Of course, I'm sure that I'm kind of getting cheated out by having the same encumbrance if I was wearing plate mail or chainmail. Chainmail should be lighter and easier to get around with, so it would have a lesser encumbrance. So in that case, I'm a little bit cheated with my halfling. And I also suspect that the total gear that I have is probably pretty close to around 70 pounds of gear. Having a couple of weapons, having a rack of arrows and 50 feet of rope and things like that. It probably is fairly close. I might look at the experts at one time and calculate it all out and find out how much or how little it is. But for what we know, there is an appeal to the simplicity of this game. Also, if you had played Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and looked at all of the different tables and things that you have to pore over, having your attributes as simple as 0, +1, +2, or +3, and that's all you have to worry about, certainly could be a very appealing thing. Basic D&D is every bit as much of a robust fantasy role-playing game. You just have a little bit less realism, less simulationism. There's a lot of abstraction involved in this. And, quite honestly, the accessibility paid off. This game brought lots of people into playing Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy games. Many people have fond memories of the Red Box, and those who got into this very basic version of Dungeons and Dragons, many of them moved on to the Expert set, the Blue Box, which gave you even more rules, more monsters, and rules for overland travel, and your first inkling into the world of Mystara, starting out in the starting hub town of Threshold in the Duchy of Karamikos, and setting up different nationalities around that were, hostile or friendly, racially divided or integrated. And then you go to the companion set, and then you start talking about the politics of kings and armies, and your adventurers may have strongholds by this point. So Expert would bring you up to 10th level. Beyond that, you could start thinking about building a castle and holding territory, or building a temple and claiming a religious theocracy. You had lots of options. Dungeons and Dragons is always about giving you options on what you do. Maybe the classes seem a little bit limiting to people who prefer classless systems, certainly. But as far as what you can do within these rules, the sky is pretty much the limit. Some weaknesses. Of course, I always love the quote, "I always wanted to grow up to be an elf." Having your race determine your abilities is kind of a strange pattern to go along. Dwarves are all fighters. Well, if you play other versions of Dungeons and Dragons, dwarves can be other classes. Even in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, they could be thieves, they could be fighters. However, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons had some interesting limitations on the races. For example, only humans could be clerics, which is odd. There doesn't seem to be anything inherently in elves or dwarves that they are godless heathens who can't commune and possibly draw down power. As we find in later editions, those kind of restrictions get scrapped. I'm not sure if 2nd edition scrapped them. We will be exploring 2nd edition soon enough. But certainly by 3rd edition, any class could be found among all the different races. Unlikely for some, certainly. You're not going to find a lot of wizards among dwarves, even in modern day, unless, of course, your dungeon master creates that in their world. It's just generally they don't do that. But in this, if you're a halfling, you have a role. You're going to be a primarily missile fighter because that's where your strengths are. Nothing stopping you if you roll a ridiculously high strength. Your halfling could absolutely, not choose to use missile weapons, but if they do, they're going to be pretty good with them. Your elf is automatically a fighter magic user. Because of elves' love of magic, all elven adventurers in basic Dungeons and Dragons have that outlook, and they combine those two abilities. fairly seamlessly. There's a lot of hedging in playing multi-class characters in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons about, if you want to cast a spell and you're a fighter magic user, do you have to take off your armor so that you can move unencumbered? There's different rules and things to think about that sometimes make some of those abilities not work so well. Hiding in full armor, for instance. If you're going to play a multi-class with the thief, you can't do that. But my halfling here could, in full armor, hide just fine because of his ability to freeze in place and be small and unnoticeable. So, there are give and take options throughout this game. And this isn't a game that gives lots and lots of player options as far as streamlining your classes and such. You roll, you see what you get, you choose a class. Your class kind of gives you what you can do, and then you can pick your gear, and that's your input. How you then play it after that, it's up to you, but there was a certain amount of confinement. It definitely held you by the hand and directed you on the most common path to fit in one of these archetypal character classes. So it's how I started, and I told some fantastic stories using this gaming system. It is fine. It is a perfectly functional game system. But obviously people sometimes crave more crunch, and this is not going to give them that until you get to the higher levels. Now, for those of you who are looking for this kind of experience, but you don't want to get all of these different sets, understandable. The good news is they came out with a rule cyclopedia, which is a bound book. You can download the PDF now, but it encompassed all of the rules with the exception of the Immortals rules. There's a nod to it, but it doesn't go into the detail that the Immortals rules does. And that has all of the different iterations as far as alternate classes that you can play with, because they did expand some of the classes. And for example, druids were neutral clerics, so that once they hit 9th level, they had to decide if they wanted to go and be a druid or if they wanted to continue being a cleric. These were things that the game branched out and evolved into as you advanced along. The Rule Cyclopedia gives you those rules from the get-go so that you can look at them and decide how you're going to branch out your character from first level. You can start making decisions like that. And truth be told, it's a very solid system. It's robust. It gives you lots of options. It has some interesting ideas that eventually gets taken and used in 2nd edition, things like weapon mastery and such, which in the BECME set doesn't come out until your master levels rules. So the Rule Cyclopedia is an excellent buy for anybody who's looking for a version of Dungeons and Dragons that is simple, easy to play, with lots of unfolding options for those who want to use them. Lots of optional stuff. But you can strip it down back to just the level that we were doing here, if you wanted to. So, this is my character witness. Here before you, the entire mechanism revealed. I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have. One of the interesting things, I momentarily thought to say, I wish I could have shown you a better character, but quite honestly, the character falls well within the bell curves of character. I did end up with a slightly higher stat, so I do have a role, and my character can be fully functional in a group. So I ended up with a solid character, and all of these considerations are the things that countless players have had to wrestle with throughout the Dungeons & Dragons experience. What if your stats don't make you Conan or Merlin? That can sometimes happen, but you can still make an engaging and interesting character that will be functional and get to do cool things in the imaginary world that you and your Dungeon Master help build together. So, I'm Rob, here once more for another character witness. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope you stay tuned. Coming up, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So, looking forward to that. Thank you, and farewell. May your dice roll true.